Our gospel reading today is from the Gospel of Matthew, the 26th chapter, the 14th to the 16th verse. Selected readings from the 26th through the 27th chapter, the 54th verse. Hear with me now the word of God. Then one of the 12, who was called Judas Iscariot, went to the chief priests and said, "What will you give me if I deliver him to you?" And they paid him 30 pieces of silver. And from that moment he sought an opportunity to betray him. When it was evening, he sat at table with the 12 disciples, and as they were eating, he said, "Truly, I say to you, one of you will betray me." And they were very sorrowful and began to say to him one after another, "Is it I, Lord?" He answered, "He who has dipped his hand in the dish with me will betray me. The Son of Man goes as it is written of him, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born." Judas, who betrayed him, said, "Is it I, Master?" And he said to him, "You have said so." While he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a great crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the elders of the people. Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I shall kiss is the man. Seize him." And he came up to Jesus at once and said, "Hail, Master!" And he kissed him. And Jesus said to him, "Friend, why are you here?" Then they came up and laid hands on Jesus, and they seized him. Now when morning came, all the chief priests and the elders of the people took counsel against Jesus to put him to death. And they bound him and led him away and delivered him to Pilate the governor. And when Judas, his betrayer, saw that he was condemned, he repented and brought back the 30 pieces of silver to the chief priests and the elders, saying, "I have sinned in betraying innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? See to it yourself." And throwing down the pieces of silver in the temple, Judas departed, and he went and he hanged himself. Now, at the feast, the governor was accustomed to release for the crowd any one prisoner whom they wanted, and they had then a notorious prisoner called Barabbas. And so when they had gathered, Pilate said to them, "Whom do you want me to release for you, Barabbas or Jesus, who is called Christ?" For he knew that it was out of envy that they delivered him up. Now the chief priests and the elders persuaded the people to ask for Barabbas and to strike Jesus. And the governor again said to them, "Which of the two do you want me to release for you?" And they said, "Barabbas." Pilate said to them, "Well then, what shall I do with Jesus, who is called the Christ?" They all said, "Let him be crucified." And he said, "Well, why? What evil has he done?" But they shouted all the more, "Let him be crucified." So when Pilate saw that he was gaining nothing, but rather that a riot was beginning, he took water, he washed his hands before the crowd, and he said, "I am innocent of this man's blood. See to it yourselves." And the people answered, "His blood be on us and on our children." And then he released for them Barabbas, and having scourged Jesus, delivered him to be crucified. And when they came to a place called Golgotha, which means the place of a skull, they offered him wine to drink, mingled with gall. But when he tasted it, he would not drink it. And when they had crucified him, they divided his garments among them by casting lots, and then they sat down and they kept watch over him there. And over his head they put the charge against him, which read, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Now from the 6th hour, there was darkness over all the land until the 9th hour. And about the 9th hour, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, "Eli, Eli, lama sabachthani?" That is, my God, why hast thou forsaken me?" Some of the bystanders hearing it said, "This man is called Elijah." And one of them at once ran and took a sponge, filled it with vinegar, and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink. And the others said, "Wait, let us see whether Elijah will come to save him." And Jesus cried again with a loud voice, and he gave up his spirit. And behold, the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom, and the earth shook, and the rocks were split, and the tombs were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of the tombs after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. And when the centurion and those who were with him, keeping watch over Jesus, saw the earthquake and what took place, they were filled with awe. And they said, "Truly, this was the Son of God." God's blessings be on the reading of his most holy word. And may the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be always in thy sight, Lord, my strength and my Redeemer. You know, the cross of Christ is many things. It's a symbol of shame and scandal, an instrument of torture, of a barbaric punishment. It's a sign of human brutality and sin. But for Christians, it is something more. It is all for the guilt, all the shame, and all the horror that attaches itself to it. It is a symbol of love. The symbol of God's love for us. The symbol of Christ's love. The symbol of reconciliation between God and us, and the symbol of our willingness to be reconciled to each other. So the cross is a cross of contradictions. And why not? There is what appears to be a great contradiction in what we, like countless millions of Christians, are doing today. Here we are celebrating how Jesus came riding into Jerusalem and was acclaimed by the common people as the Messiah, and we are ourselves acclaiming him as our Messiah and the Lord in the same manner. And then we are telling the story of how the common people, the same crowd that welcomed him on the streets of the holy city, call for his death a few days later. A death plotted by the rulers of the temple and by the religious leaders of the nation into which he was born. Now, it's just a little crazy to see the signs of welcome, the signs of approval, the signs of the prayer, "Lord, save us now, Hosanna in the highest," and to be confronted in how these signs of welcome have been woven together with the sign of rejection, the sign of disgrace, the sign of torture, the sign of death. And yet, aren't our lives filled with contradictions? These crazy weather patterns. Snow one day, shirt sleeve weather the next. A perfectly healthy young person suddenly riddled with cancerous tumors. Close to 25% of the children in one of the wealthiest countries in the world. We live in poverty. More than enough food produced each year to feed the entire world's population, and millions dying of starvation while millions die from overeating. All these are signs of great contradictions, great craziness. But the story of the cross itself is a story of contradictions. You know, as Jesus entered the eastern gate on a donkey in Jerusalem on this as a sign of peace and salvation, the ruling Romans who controlled people were coming in on the western gate, and a visible sign of power and control. So Jesus, who was the symbol of the freedom from fear, was contradicted by the ultimate symbol of power and fear. Jesus entered Jerusalem to the welcoming shouts and prayers of his people. He knew full well that he was going to be killed within the week. He knew, as his people called out to him for salvation on Palm Sunday, that they would also call out for his death, and that despised and rejected, he would suffer death upon the cross. Perhaps God allowed all this to happen because I believe God at times does his best work in the midst of our contradictions. The contradictions and the craziness of this world, these contradictions and that craziness we experience in our workplace and in our homes, and which we encounter in our neighbors and see in our kith and kin, and indeed within our own selves. More and more we see those we used to trust living contradictory lives exposed by the media, the result of desiring privilege without responsibility, honor without humility, profit without work, power without accountability, and pleasure without having to love or to share. And Jesus knew this truth from his mother's knee, and from the teachings of the law and the prophets, and from the heart of God disclosed to him as he prayed, the heart of God shown him by his Spirit. Jesus knew that the people of God would sing songs to him one day and call for his death the next, because we humans are so capable of doing this. But then, God created us to be contradictory. If he was to make us at all, if he was to make us to be like himself, if he was to make us free, creative, and loving, God would have to make us contradictory. From the beginning of time, God has been a bit contradictory. God destroyed the world in the flood, only to recant and send a rainbow as a promise he would never do this again. God reigned and raved with Moses over the recalcitrance of the children of Israel, but he always forgave them in the end. And I believe that at the root of this, God has wanted us to be rather than to not be. The glory of Jesus, the glory of God, is found in how God has entered into our contradictions and our craziness and taken upon himself the death that should be ours. The glory of God, the glory of Jesus, is how he is raised on a cross before he is raised from the dead. So the cross itself is a contradictory symbol. It's a symbol of God's love for us and a symbol of violence that no one wants to see, no one wants to think about today. But on a Dallas church lawn a few years ago, there stood a cross. The church pulled together weapons and they were confiscated by the Dallas police. There were guns and pistols and knives and bayonets and bullets and bombs and broken bottles. And the cross rose up out of this old wrecked automobile that had been smashed flat in a traffic accident. And the base was surrounded by barbed wire entanglements that looked like a prison. And no one wanted to see it. There were cries in the newspapers to have it removed. It was a sacrilege. It was a desecration. It was a cross that no one wanted to see or think about. But in all contradictions, however, there are two sides. No one wants to see the cross of violence. No one wants to see the cross of pain Jesus endured. We prefer the cross of love. But today, look at the cross we must. The adulation of the crowd on that first Palm Sunday was only a distant memory as he climbed the hill known as Golgotha, the place of the skull. Where were the disciples? Just a few hours before, they had been sitting at a table, dining together. Peter was so brave, he was proclaiming he would never deny Jesus, and what did he do? He denied him 3 times, cowering in fear. Another contradiction. Judas betrayed him, then has remorse, and he kills himself. The Roman governor debated truth with him in the praetorium, claiming his innocence. And what does he do? He washes his hands of him. And there's Jesus himself. He's crying from the cross intense feelings of abandonment. And then he has the unfathomable spiritual strength to forgive the world for what they've done to him. It's incredible. And in the end, what is it? It's a Roman soldier who realizes that this truly was the Son of God. Look at all these contradictions. But all these contradictions are a part of God's immense plan for our redemption. All these contradictory events add up to the fact that God is doing his best work through Jesus on that cross and for you and me. So nobody really wants to think of the cross of violence. We would rather think of the cross of Christ, which draws us all here today, no matter what else it might be, a sign of reconciliation, love, and peace. But in these contradictions, the cross becomes God's way of reaching into us and making things right. God sometimes enters into our hearts and minds in the contradictory moments of life and does his best work. In the tension created by those contradictions, God brings us to our knees in forgiveness. He brings us to new beginnings. He brings us beginnings which we can go and heal the wounds in our hearts and in the hearts of others. In those contradictions, we get on our knees and we come to God. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. My friends, the good news is that the Father has forgiven us. That is what the cross is also about. That is what Jesus laid down his life for. This is what Jesus came to do. And so today, with millions of Christians everywhere, we are hailing Jesus as Messiah one moment and plotting to kill him in the next. And yet today, God is doing his best work. Grief becomes joy. Betrayal turns into forgiveness. Separation becomes reconciliation. So I adjure you, I'm going to ask you to do something today. When you leave this service, I want you to go and call someone you're at odds with. Reach out your hands across the walls that divide you from someone, from anyone, as Christ has reconciled himself to us. It's contradictory to do that. But in those contradictions, we are reconciled to each other. We are made one. To the glory of God.